6 steps to create a procedural crack texture inside of Redshift. What I'm going to show you is a super useful technique for creating cracks in pottery, damaged cement, or any object that needs finely detailed destruction. We can preset it out and apply it to any object. Why procedural and not use image-based crack textures? In short, 2 main reasons I prefer it. No UVs, and it's easy to create variations. Also, you can paint cracks in real time, like Substance, without the round trip. As an important side note, I'm going to be making these cracks more intense for the sake of YouTube compression and smaller screens. On your end, I suggest you make it more subtle. Okay, so here's the node that we're going to be creating right here. I called it Crack Anything. And basically, we've got 4 outputs: the color channel, the bump channel, the roughness channel, and the ambient occlusion, or like the crack tint. And you can see it's plugged into each of these channels here in the standard shader. And all this is a group of nodes inside. You can see I've exposed several parameters. So we've got the general crackle amount, which is just a crack that's smaller cracks that go along the whole surface of the pattern. So that doesn't need to be visible. You can always just turn it down using this. This is the large crack, where you can randomize by changing this value. It'll randomize the cracks, the large cracks along the surface. Then this is the scale of the large cracks. Then we've got the bump amount. And then here's this distance fade. So if I zoom out, you can still see the cracks are visible. And if I zoom in here, you can see the cracks actually get lighter and less visible. If I was to zoom out without this, you would not see the cracks. So this is a way of making smaller details visible from further distances. And lastly, you can see we've got a vertex map that I can just drag in here, a link, and then it will mask out. And so I could paint, if I double click it, turn off the render here, you can see I've just painted a vertex map and dragged it in, drag it into this link. And then what it'll do is it will mask those cracks. So if we take a look inside here, you can see this is the structure, the node structure. It might look complex, but it actually isn't. You can see down here is the distance calculation setup with some exposed parameters, and then this stacking. For the actual build out, since I made this, I've improved it slightly. So I'm going to show you a couple new techniques that I came up with since I've built this out. So what we're going to be creating is going to be a little bit bigger than this. Anyways, let's start with the first phase. This channel is new and your support is greatly appreciated. You can do so by smashing the like button if you find this content useful, and stay up to date with any new content I release by subscribing. Make sure you click that notification bell so you can see my community posts where I'll be sharing free resources. So let's dive in. Okay, so let's get started here. I'm going to start off with a blank, unchanged shader, and you can just double click and it brings you up a new one. That's all I've done. Let's replace it by dragging it on the shader ball. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a layer. I'm going to make things a little bit quicker and easier. I like doing this. We don't need the image here. I'm going to click and enable all of these. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down the list here and add the swatch. So if you hold Control and you click, so the first 2 are done. So I'll just come in here, Control click. We don't need masks for these yet, so I'm going to get rid of them. Okay, so here's our layer shader. And to bring this up, you just double click. And then to add, you hold down Control and you click the dot. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to plug it in here, disable these. And our base color is going to be white. And we'll set this to multiply. In fact, what we should have done is we should have enabled multiply on all these. Okay, so we've added multiply. I'm going to go ahead and collapse these now. So let's bring up a noise. So I'm going to double click here, bring in a max on noise, disable the shader preview here. And this is going to be one we just duplicate. So we're going to leave the base blank. And the reason we're going to do that is if you look here, what we want to be able to do is fade these in and out and reveal the white, because the cracks are going to be black. The background is going to be white. So we'll plug this into our first one here, solo it, turn on our IPR. We'll bring this up to something like 35%. And we need to change our noise type to Roanoy 3. And how this works is we're going to be bringing this high clip all the way to here. And this value is going to change in increments somewhere around here to very, very small, depending on a parameter. And that is going to be this exponent. What this exponent does is if I just crank this up, it kind of rounds out the noise pattern. And then if I bring it in, it kind of crackles it, and you can see it kind of hides it. So I'll bring this high clip up. And as I get closer to 0, it's going to get more distorted. And this looks pretty cool. We can use this for cracks. And I found the sweet spot for the base is like 1.5, and we'll bring this into here. Now, like I mentioned, I'm going to make these cracks slightly more intense for the sake of YouTube viewing. I would suggest you bring your values down to like even thinner than this, like somewhere around there. So really small values. I'll leave it pretty thick for now, just for viewing purposes. And we can also bring up the contrast and mess with that. Now, what you ideally need to do is play with this value and then this exponent. So I'm going to drag this up, make a duplicate, drag it into layer number 2, enable number 2. What we're going to be doing now is adjusting this exponent. I'm going to set it to 1. And you can see we now have cracks that follow, but they're slightly more distorted. So I'm going to do that one more time. And I'll set the exponent to like 0.75 so we get a more distorted noise. You can see it's more edgy. Let's enable it. So there you go. Now I want to kind of randomize this and not have it visible in every section here. So what we can do is we could mess with the mask option. I want to leave that available. I actually have been preferring doing it in line. And what do I mean by that? So I'm going to take my max on noise here. And so this one here, I'm going to name this. I'm going to call this big 2. So these are based off of, these two are based off this one. So these ones I want to add variation to. So what I can do is I can go into the base. Remember, black is the crack. So if I load up a shader into it by command clicking, bring in this noise here, and if I just solo it, you can see we now have a randomization happening. So you can see it's knocking it out. If I crank this up, we're knocking away some of it. So this value you're going to mess with to get the right crack masking. We can take this, duplicate it, and let me change the seed type. Load it up in this black channel here. So you can see we have variation. I'm going to make these slightly thicker because when you mess with the exponent, remember you have to bring this value up or down. So in our case, when we go exponent lower, you need to move the high clip up to kind of thicken it back up. So there we go. We're moving along here. And one thing you're going to want to do in the later section, we're going to put a controller so that if we change this seed type, the seed always matches. So what we could do is if we want to see a different seed, we can just select all 3 of these and set this to like 0 and get a different seed type, but they'll need to match. Number 3 looked good. So the main base, you can see it's kind of thick in some of the seed types. We can always thin it out more by bringing the high clip down. So there's our base cracks. So I can close these up. Let's give ourselves some more space. Okay, next, what we want to do is we want to add some cracks coming off these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the base sub cracks, and I'm going to take this noise here and I'm going to do some variations. So I'll bring this up to say 30, change the random seed, change the noise type to Roughness, bring this down. There we go. So these cracks are the same as these ones here with just slight differentiation in the scale. In fact, I'm going to go smaller. Let's do half the size, so 15. Now, what I want to do is I want to mask off these cracks and have a feather around it so they come off this and they feather in. So these big areas will have a gap. So right now, if I look at it, they're kind of filling in those gaps. So I'll enable number 4. You can see it's filling in. So what we want to do is we're going to take our big base cracks and we'll call this mask. I like making the masks bright green. So this is going to become our mask. So let's solo it. And what we want to do is we want to have the inversion. So these cracks are white with a nice feather on it. So I'm going to actually just take my low clip and invert these values. So you can see if I go below this value on the high clip, it starts inverting. And I want to pick somewhere kind of in the middle here and also just add a little bit of contrast. So we get something like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the layer 4, add a mask here, drag in this like so. And you can see now we have cracks based off of the shape. And the weight of these are kind of inverted. These actually should be a little thicker now that I'm seeing it. There we go. So now we have cracks coming off the main cracks. I'm going to just take this, duplicate it, add it to number 5, enable the mask, bring in the mask here, change the value. So there we go. So now we have cracks coming off and we have more variation. You can also change this size down to like 10. Now we have smaller cracks. Because I made them smaller, I can bring up this value. And we're around there. And now we can enable all of our cracks that we have so far. And you can build up this look. So these two are randomized off of this main one. And these ones are the same with exponent changes to them, the exponent value. So that's the difference between these two. And you could add more and do an extra layer. Now, this last one I'm going to do is an overall small crackle. We're going to use a Fresnel to mask out and add some noise to it. But essentially, we want to be able to see the cracks more around the edges, not forward facing. So to do that, we'll take this big crack and I'll call this overall. And I'll add it to number 7. I'm going to skip that because I might want to add more of the same here. So this overall crack, we'll solo, scale it down to like, let's try 6. Bring up this value here to like 3 so we can see it. Let's go a little bit bigger. There we go. So this value is going to be for the large cracks. And then what I can do is I want to add another subversion of these. So if I go in and add it to the white channel, it'll fill in the noise in these white areas. So I'll take this and scale this down to like half 3, change the seed, some random number, load it in. And now you can see we have smaller cracks within those cracks. And there we go. So those are going to be our sub cracks. And then what we can do is we can add our mask here to number 6. Nope, sorry, 7. Add the mask. And what we'll do is we'll immediately just add a Fresnel. And I'll also make this green. Add it in. I'm going to turn off all the other cracks. We're just looking at what we're dealing with here. And if we look at the Fresnel, it's too perfect. It doesn't have the right gradient on it. So what we'll do is we're going to uncheck this refractive index value so it's no longer using this. And you'll see it kind of popped with more contrast. I'm going to bring this down to, so our base was set to 5. Let's try 4, 3. So what I want to do is I want to add variation to this Fresnel, like a noise. So you can see our maximum that we'd want to do is somewhere around 2, and our minimum and max is around 5. So 2 and 5. So what I'll do is I'll come in here and add a change range, and we'll put 2 and 5. We'll add it to the curve fall off. And then we'll add a noise. So I'll come up here and grab a noise. Change the scale. Add a blistered turbulence. I like that one for this. And there's our variation in our crack visibility. And you can see I can move around and it updates with that nice noise texture. There's the cracks that are more visible, and it might be hard to see on the screen here, but you can see here the cracks are more visible on the edges. We can also change this change range to something like 1.25 so we get even more. So we can move this brightness value like this, and it will reveal more of those cracks. And that's something that I'm looking for. So I wanted the cracks to kind of be somewhere like almost in the middle, and then you can see it's faded out. And you also get cracks along these ridges here. This works out nicely, those settings. So I'll call this one will be, I'll call it crackle. So that's my crackle. So I want to visually group these. So I'll say group and scaffold, and I'll call this crackle. Group these together. All these main, and these ones here are the sub cracks. There we go. Okay, so for this next phase, we're going to do the bump. So let's zoom in here and add a bump and plug it in. Let's give ourselves some more space here. If I solo this and I'll enable all the cracks, what we want to do is bump. The way it works is middle value, so 50% gray bumps nothing. To bump up is white, and to bump down is black. So we only want these cracks to bump down from a middle value. So we'll bring in a change range here. Drag it into the change range, drag it in. And then we want the white values to be 50% gray. And that's the proper bump setup. I'm going to disable the color, unsolo this. And you can see our bump is really, really intense. So we'll bring this down to 0.1. And you can go lower and whatnot. That's up to you. I'm going to leave it kind of intense for this sake, but I'll bring it down just a little bit more. And you can see if I look on the sides, we have more crackle happening around the edges because it condenses using the Fresnel. And then we got these cracks here. So I basically added a ton of cracks, but what you can do is you can enable and disable depending on the material you're using. So I like to have the whole kitchen sink on it and then just pull back parts that I'm not using. So next, what we want to do is I want to make this material white, and I want to show you the next thing, which is going to be adding a mask. So to get the mask to work, we're going to do vertex maps. So I'm going to add a vertex map. I'll go to other, and it's off the screen, but there's vertex map. So it adds this, and we'll give it a name. So I called it masking demo, and we'll bring in a vertex attribute, drag in our mask into the link here. And I found the best way to do this is to add a layer, color layer. And there's a bunch of ways you could do this. We'll get rid of these here, and we'll plug in our base color is going to be white because we're going to be removing. So our base is white, and then we'll plug in our color into the color channel and our attributes, mask into the mask, solo it, and you can see it's gone. And so now what I can do is I can double click with the Redshift IPR off. And when you double click it, you get the brush tool, and we can then just paint what we want. So let's do some at the base. You can see I can now paint. I can paint cracks where I want them, and I can hold control and subtract areas. Say we don't want any, hold down control. Paint the bottom. Follow some cracks up to the top here. And that's how you can paint those cracks in real time. Really, really cool. So I'll bring this into the bump channel. We'll give ourselves some more space. So instead of doing this, we're going to just plug this into the input. And this I'll call masking. Vertex masking. I'll give these both a green color. So there's the masking feature. Very simple to do. And I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible. There's other ways you could do it, but this way seems to be the simplest. So let's do roughness. So roughness, we're going to just bring this into a base. So we'll do another layer. Base color is going to be black. So we'll keep that. We'll bring in our mask here into layer 1. Set it to add or screen. It's up to you. Doesn't really matter. Bring this into the roughness. And now the areas that are rough, let's solo it. And we want the invert of this. So I'm going to just invert, color invert, give ourselves some space here between these. So our vertex map comes in here, inverts it, and then we come in. And what this color layer will be able to do is we can add different noises to kind of create variation. So roughness. So now what's happening is you can see it's ultra shiny. So in the color layer here, if I want to roughen it up, I can just do some percentage here in this gray value here, and then roughen it up. And then the areas that are cracked are going to be the most rough. And so if I want to bring in a little bit of shininess to the crack, I can just back off this value. Okay, let's bring in the ambient occlusion, which is going to require us to do this distance fade effect. So when you do ambient occlusion, you load it up into the overall tint. So I'll command click, and I'm just going to drag in this value into the overall tint, make a point, Control Shift clicking adds a node rerouter. And what we want to do is we want to put a distance calculation in between these. Because you can see when I'm further back, we want these cracks to be visible. But when we're close, we don't want this so intense. So we can fade based off of the distance from the camera. So let's set that up. Okay, so to get this distance fade to work, we're going to be working right here. We first need a node I haven't talked much about, but it's called the state. And this tool is super, super useful. I'm going to bring this over here, and I'm going to load up like the normal into here. and you can see it shows us the normals of the direction of these polygons. The one that we're going to be messing with is called the ray length. So in order to get this to work, it's going to just show up white because we need to reroute this, remap it. So I'm going to do a change range. And I'm going to also use, after the change range, a ramp. And this is a color ramp. And this color ramp, we don't want the interpolation to have a curve to it. So I'm going to set them both to linear. You can see it's more consistent now. We'll add this into the alt input, drag this in. And you can see it just changed slightly, but nothing's happening. And what we need to do is our first two values are going to be the beginning and end point of the distance. So the closest is 0. The furthest, let's just try 100. You can see now what happens is as I get further away, so I get closer, it's going to darken the mask, which means hide it. And then as I go back, now a better way to see this that I find is I like making these red. So I know I'm at the max. Set this to red. Let's do green. And I'll set this to 99 and this one to 1. So when it's the extreme close up, it's going to turn red, and the extreme distance, it's going to turn green. You can see there's our distance value. So you can see as I zoom in, it's going to go down in, and then once I hit, now I want it to start fading sooner, not at 1 or 0. So I'm going to set this to something like, this is going to be the closest I'll be. Let's try 5. There we go. So let's pick something like 20. So there you go. That's going to be where it starts fading. Now, if you're using a camera focal length of like 200 or 300, these values are going to change. So these are our near value and our distance far value. This next value is going to be, these next set is going to be the value of the darkness and the lightness that it's going to be. So the darkness of these values, I'm going to set, I'll leave it at 1 and 0 for now. We can collapse this, move these over. Mask, so we'll do a layer. So our base we want to be white, and then we'll bring in our mask and our color channel here. This in, overall tint, and then we'll get rid of this red and green, bring these out, and then bring our original back in. So you can see it popped. So here's our distance, max distance, and as we get closer, you can see it fades out. So you can see these cracks appear when we're further away, which really helps sell this. So let's do the distance range, 150. And again, these values are going to be different for you. So I don't want it this dark when I'm this far away. I want it to be like 0.6. So you can see, we can still see the cracks this far away. And then when we get close here, I want them visible just a little bit. So I'm going to put it to like 0.1. 0.2 looks good. And when you add a pattern to this pottery, you're going to probably need to adjust these max and min values. So the first two are distance values and then how bright that mask is going to be. So now you can see, I zoom out, I can still see the cracks, zoomed in, they're just more subtle. Because when you're further away, it's harder to see bump maps, especially for cracks where they're going to be subtle. So this is your way of showing those cracks without having to crank a bump map. You can also apply this same distance shader setup where you're doing the state to change range to ramp, make a preset out of it if you want, and group it up with a group. So if I come in here and I say group nodes, and then I can put on that a distance value and a brightness value, you can make your own little control rig out of that as well. And I like stacking these up like this. Move this down, right click and say group and scaffold, and I'll call this distance, dist calc. There we go. So there's our distance calculation already rocking. Super simple concept, but not obvious. Okay, so before we move forward with the distance calculation, you can see it's not taking in the mask. So what we need to do is just bring in the mask. So now it's working. Okay, so let's move to the next phase, which is making this reusable. To make this reusable, I'm going to take and just mention a few things. So our crackle, we want to see the edges less cracked or more cracked. So I'm going to get rid of the vertex attribute so we're not masking. So we can see this. I'm also going to make the bump slightly stronger than normal so we can see it better. And if I want to make the edge crackle less visible and more visible, you can see we have a problem because we can't adjust the mask here because it's being used. So we don't have a slider, but what we can do is we can say on this original noise crackle, we can fade in the black values. So I'm going to double click and type in value. And I'm going to be using this a lot, so I'll make it red. And so my controllers, I like making bright red, and I'll just drag this here, make a version of it. Okay, so I've got this crackle amount. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect this slider to 100% to 0% visibility. And to do that, we want these cracks to fade in and out. So I'll open this up here and expose the black parameter, drag this in, and we also want to do the black on this one here. So you can see we've got that value. Now I want to invert this value. So I'll type in invert. There we go. So now you can see we have a fade slider for the edge crackle amount. Next, what we want to do is we want to bring in another value here. I'll drag this up here and duplicate it. And this is going to be the random seed for large. And we'll bring up the big one here, and we want the seed to be a value. We'll bring this one up as well. Remember, these are all going to be the same, these top three. I'm command clicking or control clicking. And I'll start stacking these here. We also want to do scale because when you bring this into an object, you're not sure what size that you're going to need. And it's most likely not going to be the same scene scale as the original texture. So I'm going to take this and drag this up and give this more space because we're going to have a bunch of parameters here. These two are masks. So I'll come in here and make this 0, 25, 0. And we want to adjust the scale. So I'll come in here and bring in this overall scale, all three of these. I'll drag a float slider. Call it big scale, scale big cracks. And this value is a float slider. We want to change this from decimals to actual numbers here, so integer. And then we can change this to 35, which is the original. There we go. So now we have a slider for this here. I can make them bigger or make them smaller, and they all work. So that's that. And what else will we want to change? Well, on these subcracks, you might want to do controllers for these as well. Also, you could do the bump amount. So if I want to do bump amount, so we're at 0.125. And once we've applied and exposed all the parameters that we want, what we do is we're going to carefully select all the nodes. I'll give us a little bit of space here. So I'm going to marquee select all of my nodes. Go to group nodes, groups it, and I'll call this crack anything. And give it a cool color. Okay, so let's go ahead and expose some parameters and properly name these outputs. You can see they're plugged in correctly. We just need to change the order. So let's change this one, which is our roughness, to the top. Overall tint is the bottom and bump is the middle. So let's expose. When we select this, we want to see some attributes here. So we'll rename this one to bump. This one's going to be the overall tint. And this is going to be roughness. Okay, so we've done that. So if I come back out, I can just click in and out the top here. You can see they're properly named in the correct order. So to expose the parameters, you can take the overall bump amount, the height scale, and drag it in to expose the parameter, but it will group it up into different tabs. And I want to have it all in one. So all the parameters that I'm going to expose, I put in a value or a color swatch value. Okay, so to do this, we just click and drag and we say add new input. And that one's called bump amount. So if I go back out, select the node, you can see we have this bump amount under input tab. So I can plug this in and then quickly just change this value to adjust the bump. Go back inside. So our bump is connected. We'll do the crackle amount. We're going to do the random scale. So I want to do this in kind of the correct order. So I want this first random seed to be changed. So I'll go add new input, add new input, add new input. And we also want that mask that we're going to paint to be a property. So right here. So I'm going to add a value and we're going to put the string in here, give it a color of red. Attribute name is what we're going to expose. Plug it in. We'll call this Vertex mask. And we're going to expose this one as well. Now we can check it out, our inputs tab, and then we can just drag this in. You can see it's masking now. This is a Crack Anything Procedural Texture Node preset. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on more content. Thanks for your support.